Hi everyone, and welcome to this month's Exago lab. We're hoping that you're finding these to be helpful, and we continue to gather content as we go on to present in future months. So for the past few Exago labs, for those that have attended or those that are watching, you'll know that we covered some more basic end user concepts such as report design, chart layouts, etc. Being that those Exago labs are very much end user centric, we thought for this month we'd change things up a bit and do something a bit more technical. So the content I'm going to be presenting today will be centered around one of Exago's extensibility features, and that extensibility feature is server events. So for any non-technical users in attendance today, perhaps some of this content may be a bit over your head, but I will be giving a relatively high-level overview of the purpose of server events from a slightly less technical perspective before diving into the code of server events. So perhaps maybe in my explanation of server events at a higher level, you can derive some meaning from that and bring these features to the attention of some of the more technical minds at your organization that may be unaware that these features even exist. So if we take a look at the agenda for today's lab on server events, I'll be covering the following. So as I mentioned before, I'll begin by giving a brief explanation of what server events are and how to utilize session info, what session info means in the context of Exago, and then using some of this knowledge that that I described to you, we'll apply that to 3 different server events to satisfy 3 different needs. So with the agenda out of the way, let's get things started. So at a high level, server events in Exago allow you to insert snippets of code at predefined points within an Exago session. And this is for the altering of certain things such as properties of report executions, the logging of additional information, etc. The list of events that you have control over within Exago can be found in our technical guide. If we pull up this list here, and we also have an introduction to server events article on our knowledge base that covers all of these events. So here in the technical guide, in addition to giving the full list of server events that you have available to you, as you can see here, when you click through to each event, you'll see that we actually include a description of the purpose of that event, and then we define how you should structure the arguments in your custom code or the proper methods to ensure to use if you're creating these server events in an assembly. But we'll talk about more of these concepts in a moment. So right now we're looking at the on-report execute start server event. This is an event that we'll be using for, I believe, all but one of the server events that I'll be presenting to you today. So if you take a look at the description for this event, we can see this concept of session info. And this is something that actually holds true for all server events. So for instance, if we click on the on-report execute end server event, you'll see that we also have access to session info there, as well as this Boolean value, which you don't necessarily need to be concerned about. So the session info variable that all of these server events have the ability to view, alter, etc., is quite powerful. And what the session info variable allows you to do is it allows you to persist values within the session info variable across all your function invocations. So provided that the server event you're trying to develop against occurs before the process you're trying to alter, any property of session info that you change will be reflected in this process. If you're ever unsure as to whether or not you'll be able to alter a session info property at a certain point, or if you would like to maybe see what's available to you in the session info object if you're not familiar with it, I would recommend developing these server events in an assembly outside of Exago rather than developing them in the administration console. And to kind of give you an illustration as to what that entails, let me give you a quick example of what I mean. So I have a report here. Actually, let's back up a second. I have this server event that I've added to my own personal environment. And what the server event does is this actually pulls from a data source that I've added. It pulls from the assembly data source. So what I've done is I've added this assembly as a data source, and this assembly is just a class library that contains a class of methods. And each of these methods that I've created, which I'll show you momentarily when I launch into a debugger, each of these methods that I have created corresponds with a server event. So if I were to go and right-click on server events and hit add, I would give the server event a name. I'm not going to name it since I already have it, but I'm going to show you where it pulls from. So it pulls from the assembly data source. And then when I select this assembly data source, you'll see I have all of the methods available to me. Now, this method is a name that I actually gave my server event. This method does not mean that this is an onReportExecuteStart server event per se. This just means that I happen to name my method onReportExecuteStart. And the reason I did that was because it indicates that I'm doing this on the onReportExecuteStart method. But I could have named this event, I could have named it something more in tune with what the purpose of the event is. The purpose of this event that I've created is just to show you how you can launch into a debugger in Visual Studio. So if I were to go to my event that I've already added in my environment, you see that I've added that method from the assembly named assembly. I just named this server event assembly example. And you'll see that I've set this server event on the global event of onReportExecuteStart. So what that means is for every report execution, I'll be launching this server event method I've created in my assembly. And what this server event method will do, which I'll show you in the code momentarily, is I'm just strictly launching into a debugger. That way I can inspect what I have available to me in session info. So if I go back into my environment, like I said, I have this set globally. So if I were to just go ahead and execute this report, we see that this message pops up. Now, for some people, maybe seeing this message saying an unhandled exception has occurred, this has kind of caused some panic, but this is actually something I've intended to do. I'm intending to launch into this debugger. So I'll click yes, debug W3. I do want to launch into a new instance of Visual Studio since I don't have Visual Studio open. And I do want to attach this to the IIS app pool process. So you'll see here is my assembly that I've created. It's a class that I've named methods, and it just contains a list of methods that I can add as server events. So this in and of itself is a server event. For this server event, what I've done is I've named it, as I said before, onReportExecuteStart, and I've just passed the method signature of session_info object with the session_info variable. And what this does is this needs to match up directly to, if I navigate back to onReportExecuteStart, it needs to match up in terms of return type. So we're returning a string. The event handler name is a name that you as a user can give it. And then this is the method signature that we require. So if I'm going to be setting this server event to run on the onReportExecuteStart event, it needs to contain this method signature, otherwise you'll get an exception. So you'll see that that method signature matches up exactly with the onReportExecuteStart. You'll see that my return type of a string matches up exactly. And then for the purposes of this, I'm just returning null, because if we refer back to the tech guide, you see that when you return null on the onReportExecuteStart event, the report execution will just proceed as expected. It won't be interrupted in any way. So I've launched in this debugger window, and where this becomes helpful is if you want to inspect what you have available to you either in session info or any of the other variables or objects that you have available to you in a particular server event. So if I were to mouse over this session info variable right here, you can see that I have all of these properties available to me. So this kind of allows you as maybe a novice user of server events to inspect what you have available to you. In addition to being helpful for debugging, if you want to just have all of your server events located in one central spot, such as this assembly, this kind of makes it easy for you to just create this class library. But I won't be focusing on this primarily today. For the purposes of this example, I'll be focusing primarily on developing the server events in the administration console. Okay, so now that we've done an overview of what server events entail, as well as how you can kind of go about debugging and starting with server events if you're someone that's new to this, let's begin by walking you through some situations in which a server event could be useful. So the first server event that I'm going to be walking you through today will be utilizing the onReportExecuteStart server event, which, as we've seen a couple times in the tech guide, what it does is it allows us to work with just the session info variable, which has some of the report contents, the page info, etc., etc. So what I'm going to be doing with this server event, actually, let's go ahead and just show you what the server event will do. So the server event that I've created, which we'll walk through line by line in a moment, what it does is when you pass null values for a filter, so if I open up my filter windows here, if you pass in null values to your filter, generally what happens without this server event that I've created is when you execute the report, so I have a null value set to start with my employee last name, and I have null value set for my isBetween on the order date. If I were to execute this, whoops, looks like I still had that server event left over in my report. Kind of just got ahead of myself there a little bit. So you'll see that if I execute this report, we get no data qualified. And the reason for that, again, is because we set my filter values equal to null. They're all null values. So if you have presented your users with a situation in your environment where they have access to a report that you have created, but you're not allowing them to modify whether or not a filter actually exists, and rather you're just giving them the ability to pass in values, if they're intending to leave out a filter and their intent is to pass in a null value and have it leave out that filter, they may be kind of surprised by their output. So what the server event will do is if there are null values passed to the filter, it will actually just remove that filter from the list. So that would be the equivalent of if I set both of these to prompt for value and I executed and I removed both of these filters. You see that the filter runs with the full data set. So the equivalent of that using the server event would be if I set both of these to not prompt for value, so I won't have the option to remove these filters at runtime. And then I go ahead and I add this server event to the report. I'll talk more about the concept of adding it to a report versus adding it globally momentarily, but for the purposes of this example, we're just going to add this server event right to the report. So it's on the onReport execute start method, or event rather, and it's the remove blank filters server event. So you'll see that when I run this report, even though I had set null values as my filter criteria, you'll see that it's still executed with the full contents of the data. And that's because this server event served the purpose of going through each one of those filters, looking for null values, and removing those filters from the list. So now that we have an idea of what this server event can accomplish, why don't we go through and walk through the code. So this server event, rather than being added as an assembly, which I showed you before, was added just using our custom code editor. So the way that you would add a server event, for those that don't already know, is you would right-click, you would hit add, give the server event a name, and then you would open up the custom code window, or as I showed you before, you would select where you're pulling that server event from. So this one I've just named remove blank filters. So let's walk through the code. So the first thing you need for this server event is the namespace reference to webreports.api.reports. And the reason for that is this reports object contains the definition for the report filter collection. So you'll see if I didn't include this, if I were to go and try and compile this, which is the green check mark right here, you see that the type or namespace report filter collection could not be found. And the reason for that is we did not have this namespace reference. You'll see if I were to compile this again, you'll see the compilation successful, meaning that everything worked out okay. So let's start going through this line by line. So for the first line of the report, you'll see as my comment indicates here, our intent is to get the filters for the report. So we've defined this instance of the report filter collection object, and we've just named this variable filters, and we've set that equal to the exec filters property of the report object of session info. So the exec filters are the filters that will pass through to the execution. So we'll be using this filters variable to look at all of the different filter properties because we defined an instance of this object. Next, what we do is we just do a simple for loop where we define our starting point, being that the filters are they're indexed and they're zero-based. We do want to start at I equals 0. And then as long as I is less than the number of filters, we want to increment through it. We've then defined an instance of the filter object, which we've named filter. And what this does is this holds the position of the filter that we're evaluating. And then there's this if statement where if filter.value.length, so the length property of the value, which is also a property, equals 0, which would indicate a null value, we're going to use this method to remove the filter at the position I where this condition was true. So where the filter is equal to null, we're going to remove, and then we're going to decrement the index. That way we don't run into index out of bounds exceptions. And then lastly, because for this server event, which is the onReportExecuteStart server event, if we navigate back to the tech guide again, you'll see that the expected return is a string. So again, just like the other event that I showed you in the assembly, we're just going to be returning null, which would indicate that the report execution won't be interrupted. And again, once you write your server event, it's always best practice to hit this compilation button just to make sure you don't have any errors, because it'll be a lot less costly to find an error here than if you were to just implement this server event in a test or maybe even a production environment without checking it. Not that people generally do that, but it is always good to give that warning. So before I mentioned the concept of being able to add a server event to a particular report. And what this means, the alternative to this is if I were to implement this event globally. So for the entirety of this session, any report that would be executed would hit this event if I were to set the global event to onReportExecuteStart. And you may not always want to have a server event that you've developed affect all of the reports that are in a session. You may be developing server events that may be more specific use case for particular filters. So the way that you would add this specific server event to your filter would be to ensure that you have your show events window, which is a flag in the admin console. You'll want to ensure that your show events window is set to true. And what this does is this allows you, as I showed you before, to go into the report options, advanced, here's the events window, and then add this particular server event on the event that you would like and the server event that you're trying to add. And we'll be using that for the next example too. It actually becomes even more relevant in the next example just based on the content of the server event. Okay, moving on. Now we're going to be getting more into a server event that could serve somewhat of a diagnostic purpose. And the purpose of this server event is to display the SQL that is generated for a report and a user-facing message. So this server event will be useful if you're in a situation where you're in the report creation process and maybe the data you're seeing returned on the report. Keep in mind we're talking about the data, not the formatting or the layout of the report. If the data you're seeing being returned doesn't quite match up with what you expected, or perhaps maybe you're working with a new data object that you're still working through some kinks on, this becomes helpful in showing you the SQL that's being generated, and what it will do is it will allow you to take that SQL that's generated in the user-facing message, copy it, and then run it directly against your database, so that way you can kind of verify your output. So I will show you what that server event does momentarily, but one caveat I would like to mention is that these server events will actually not work for programmable object types. And these programmable data object types are things like store procedures, assemblies, and web services. And the reason for this is because Exago doesn't actually generate any SQL for these, but rather what it does is just punts to the data source to do that. So there actually is no SQL for us to display in a user message. So actually, if you were to have this server event enabled for a report where there was only a store procedure, it wouldn't show you the user message. It would rather just continue the execution. If you do have a scenario where you have maybe a store procedure joined to a table, what you'll do is you'll see that join reflected in the name of the store procedure joined to the table. You'll see the relevant SQL for the table, but the actual SQL of the store procedure will be hidden from the user, and that's because that's contained on the database. So let's show this server event in action. Now this server event in particular is pretty useful to add to a specific report rather than adding globally, and the reason for that is because I want to show you what happens first and then I'll explain the rationale. So you'll see I have this ShowSQL server event added on the event of onExecuteSQL statement constructed, and you'll see that if I navigate to the tech guide, we can get the description of this event. So that this event occurs just before the SQL is sent to the data source to retrieve the data for report execution, and you can use this event to inspect, log, or modify the SQL that's being generated for this report execution. And the most important part of this particular server event for this particular example is what's contained in the args array. So the args array contains a string representation of the execution SQL that you are generating at the first position. So this allows you to kind of repurpose that string and display it wherever you see fit. So if we navigate back to the report, you'll see that I've added this server event to the particular report. And if I go ahead and run this report, you'll see that rather than seeing the execution, I see the execution SQL display. And if I were to hit OK, we just go back to the report design. So I mentioned before that it's particularly helpful to add this server event if you create a server event such as this to a particular report rather than globally. And the reason for that is if you were to have it enabled as a global event, every report execution that were to occur would actually show that message. So you may be just trying to debug a particular report rather than debugging every single report that's in your environment. But that's obviously up to you as the admin to decide how you want to implement that type of server event. So just like before, why don't we go through and see what the server event is doing in the code. So again, I've created this in the custom code editor. I've just called it ShowSQL. So if I open up the custom code, you'll see that this is a relatively simple server event. And what this server event is doing is it's throwing a WR user message, which is an Exago created thing. So this WR user message takes two arguments. The first argument is what we would like to display in the message. So we are displaying what is contained at the 0 position, so the first position of the args array, which as you'll remember is the string representation of that SQL. So that's what we're going to be displaying. And then the second argument just takes the enumeration for the WR user message type, so you can determine what type of WR user message you'd like to display. And then again, because this server event is occurring on the onExecute SQL statement constructed, it's expecting some sort of string return. So that string return becomes useful if you are trying to maybe return the execution SQL, but you're trying to return a modified version of it. So you could actually return that SQL, and that would, so any modifications that you would make above this return, you could then reflect in that return, and then you have the ability to kind of modify the SQL as you see fit if you need to. Being that I'm not modifying any of the SQL for this example, and I'm just letting the report execute, show the SQL, I don't need to return anything, so I'll return null. Great. Okay, so this brings us to our third and final server event. And this server event will again be somewhat diagnostic in nature, but this server event will touch on a few other features that Exago provides within session info, which are some methods. So why don't I begin by describing it? So the server event that I have developed is actually two server events in one. The purpose of this server event is to create kind of a log file of sorts that I have determined the name for and the path to, and what I'm doing is I'm creating this log file to just track report executions and the time that elapses for a report execution. So this could be helpful if you're trying to maybe create some diagnostic information to store outside of the standard Exago logs. If maybe you're just trying to get a sense of how long reports execute, maybe what you can do to speed up certain report execution times. So this makes it pretty easy for you as an admin to kind of create this log of execution times for your own benchmarks. So the reason we need to do this in two server events is because in the first server event, all we're doing is tracking, and I'll go through this line by line again, but I just want to show you what occurs first before going through it line by line. This server event will be done on report execute start. Actually, why don't I just go through it line by line now? That'll actually be easier. So this first server event I've called track report start. And the purpose of this server event is to just track the execution time, or rather track the start time of the execution that we're trying to log. So we'll see here that we've defined a date time variable named start time now, and start time now is representational of the date time now, and now is relative to the start execution time of the report that you're executing. So what we're doing with this start time now variable is we're storing it in this set stored value method. So this set stored value method, what it does is it allows you to persist values across session info, so that way you can set them in certain places and then repurpose them either for display purposes or modification elsewhere in the sequence. because oftentimes you're trying to do something where you do need 2 server events, but you can't do everything in 1 server event. So it helps to be able to set a value somewhere and then be able to access it later. So this setStoredValue is a method provided to us off of the session_info object. And what this setStoredValue method does is it takes 2 arguments. The first argument is the name of the key. So this is some kind of identifier for this value that we're creating. So that way when we call getStoredValue in another method, we can call the name of that key. And then the second argument is the value that we're storing. So we're storing the datetime representation of the start time of the report. And then again, because this is occurring on onReport execute start and we need to do some kind of return, we can just return null. So we're setting the value here with setStoredValue, and this is on onReport execute start. So then what we can do is when we create this event on onReport execute end, which we'll set momentarily, now what we can do is we can call the getStoredValue, and we can use that value and then subtract it from the actual end time of the report. So first and foremost, for the second event, we need to add a namespace reference to system.io. And the reason for that is, again, if I were to compile this, you see that something in this custom code can't quite be found because we're missing that reference. And what's missing the reference for is this StreamWriter class that I'll be using. So I'll describe that momentarily. So you'll see if I re-add this reference to system.io, it compiles successfully. So on the first line, similar to the server event where we're tracking the start time of the report, we're creating a datetime variable called endTimeNow, and endTimeNow will be representational of the end time of the report execution. The next line that you'll see, what we're doing is we're creating a string called total time. And this total time variable is representational of the total time that it took to execute. So total time, what it does is it takes endTimeNow, it subtracts the getStoredValue of start time, which was the start time. So it's subtracting the start time from end time in minutes and then setting it to a string. And then for those that kind of are programming savvy, you'll maybe notice that I have to do this cast here for date time. So if I don't do this cast, which I'll describe what that is momentarily, you'll see that I get an error. And the reason for that is this subtract method expects to be able to subtract a datetime value. So what I need to do is I actually need to cast the return value that's returned by getStoredValue as a datetime. And the reason for that is under the covers we actually store the value for getStoredValue as an object. So you can't pass an object to this subtract method because subtract is expecting to evaluate a datetime. So we just need to do that cast there. So because I'm trying to create an execution log of report times and I want to know which reports are taking which amount of time, I want to have a string representation, so a string variable of the name property of the report on session info. So this is the fully qualified name. I'll show you what the log looks like afterwards, but this is the fully qualified folder path / report name. So down here, this is where we start to create our log. So what we need to do is we need to define a new instance of the StreamWriter class, which we've named execution log. So it's a new StreamWriter, and then we're using the StreamWriter constructor that takes 2 arguments. The first argument for this constructor is a string literal of the path / file name and file type that you're trying to write to. So this log that I'm creating will be written to this path, and it will be called executionlog.txt, so it'll be a text file. And then the second argument of this StreamWriter constructor is a Boolean representation, so Boolean being true or false. If I were to set to true, what it will do is it will append every execution that I'm doing to the log. So it will create a consolidated list of all of the executions that I'm doing. If I were to set this to false, however, what it will do is every time an execution occurs, it will just create a new log file. So it will be overwriting this executionlog.txt for every execution. So what this will do is if you were to set this to false, do an execution, and then go open up this execution log, it will only show you the last execution that you did because it will always be overwriting itself. So because we want to have a consolidated list of all executions, we do want to append all of these lines, so we set it to true. And then next what we're doing is we're using the WriteLine method on the execution log, which is our stream writer. So we're just writing a string literal for report name, so it's going to appear as report name plus the report name, which is the string representation of the report name. Then we're going to do a line break here, which is denoted by this character. And then we're going to show another string literal, which is the total time to completion, concatenate in the total time it takes to execute, and then just end it with minutes, because if you'll remember, this total time is the number of minutes that it took for that execution to occur. And then the last thing that we need to do is we just need to call the close method on our stream writer, because if we don't, we'll run into a bunch of exceptions because the stream writer never knows where to stop. And then again, because we're doing the onReportExecuteEnd method, if you were to look at the tech guide, you'll see that it expects some sort of string return. Because I'm not trying to modify anything and I want it to just proceed as normal, I'm returning null. So if I were to set these server events to run on the relevant methods, so I want my track report start to run on onReportExecuteStart, and I want my track execution end to run on onReportExecuteEnd. Now what will occur is if I do a execution, so this report here, I just want to make sure I haven't added this redundantly to the report. Okay, great. So now when I run this report, so the report runs as normal, but what it's doing behind the scenes is it's creating that log that contains the execution. So if I navigate to the path where I've stored my log, you'll see all the executions that I've done with this server event turned on, and then you'll see the total time elapsed, and then this was the string that I created. And you could even get more creative here. You could start adding in the user ID and the company ID of the execution. If you wanted, I'm sure you could get the server event to display the actual execution time just in a WR user message on the onReportExecuteEnd. So maybe you want to run a report and then step away and you just want to come back and figure out how long it took. So you really, the sky's the limit there, so you can get pretty creative with these. So this actually brings us to the end of today's Exago lab. So we look forward to seeing the rest of you in future months, where we will do some more technical concepts. We'll also start mixing in, or rather we'll start mixing in more technical concepts, and then we'll cover some end user based concepts. So thank you very much for attending today, and enjoy your day.